My sister-in-law falsely accused me of cheating on my husband, so I threatened legal action, exposed her lies, and made her beg to stay out of jail. Husband and their 6 kids, my in-laws, have a very toxic dynamic with my husband, and it's starting to spill into my life. You see, growing up, my husband was the favored golden child, and his mother was especially attached to him. Jacob has told me that since his dad was often preoccupied with work, he and his mom spent a lot of time together. However, I've noticed that his sister, Sarah, doesn't receive the same treatment from my mother-in-law. While I do believe she loves both her children, it's obvious she favors Jacob. I'm sure Sarah must have sensed this as a child, which might explain why Jacob has always made an effort to be a caring older brother, supportive, present, and protective. But sometimes both Sarah and my mother-in-law act so absurdly, it crosses a line. For instance, when Jacob and I first began dating, he had just graduated from college, and he still lived with his parents and Sarah. His parents had given him an entire floor for himself, so he could have privacy and invite over whoever he wanted. Because of this, I would occasionally stay the night. But on multiple mornings, Sarah would barge into our room without knocking, while we were still asleep. As you can imagine, we were sometimes not even fully dressed, and yet she'd waltz in and start chatting with Jacob about the most random things, acting like it was no big deal. I found it incredibly inappropriate, especially because she saw me in my lingerie more than once. Before anyone points fingers, I know Jacob was living with his family then, and yes, I should have anticipated some of this. But is it really too much to expect someone to knock before entering a bedroom? Maybe siblings can be unusually close, but Sarah and I barely knew each other at that point, so her behavior came off as plain disrespectful. I eventually brought it up to Jacob and told him I wouldn't come over again unless he installed a lock on his door. He agreed, but of course, Sarah found out the next morning when she tried to barge in and couldn't. She began screaming at us through the door, demanding to know why it was locked. She jiggled the handle and pounded on it until Jacob finally let her in. She stormed inside, furious, demanding to know why he needed a lock in the first place. The moment she saw me, she pointed at me and screamed, "Is this because of that skank?" I was stunned at how nasty and offensive she was being. Jacob immediately told her it was his decision to install the lock, not mine, but she wasn't having it. She ranted that siblings shouldn't have secrets, and he shouldn't be locking her out. Jacob calmly explained that there were no secrets, and the lock was simply to prevent her from walking in on us while we were asleep. It was disturbing and unacceptable. Upon hearing that, she snapped her head toward me and shouted that this was all my fault, that I was getting in between her and her brother. It was too much. I'm naturally non-confrontational, so I excused myself to go to the bathroom. From inside, I could still hear her shouting and Jacob trying to calm her down. When she finally left, Jacob came to comfort me. He was genuinely sorry for her outburst and promised he would talk to her and make sure she apologized. The following weekend, when I visited again, she did apologize, but it felt half-hearted. She claimed she'd needed to urgently talk to Jacob, so she thought it was fine to walk in. Jacob firmly told her not to disturb us again, and she gave a meek nod. While that particular issue was resolved, her strange behavior didn't stop there. If Jacob and I ever had a disagreement, even over something as trivial as a movie, and Sarah was around, she'd butt in and say Jacob should date someone who shared his interests, and that we were clearly not compatible. Jacob would glare at her in disapproval, but she'd just smirk. There were also times she asked me invasive questions about my past, clearly trying to dig into my personal history. Jacob and I had been open with each other from the beginning, but that didn't mean I wanted to share every detail with his sister. Yet she kept prying. Or she'd make comments like, "My brother's ex-girlfriend was so much prettier than you." These remarks always came when we were alone, and I gradually began to suspect that she was deliberately trying to mess with me and bring me down. At first, I bit my tongue, but as her behavior continued, I eventually reached a breaking point. One day, after another of her little jabs, I snapped back and told her I actually liked my ex-boyfriend's family more than Jacob's, because at least they weren't nosy or overbearing. She looked taken aback, and that seemed to finally shut her up for a while. And honestly, what I said wasn't even a lie. Sarah had a twisted dynamic with Jacob, but my mother-in-law wasn't any better. When I first came into Jacob's life, she mostly ignored me. But the moment she realized things were getting serious between us, she started treating me like I was stealing her son. At dinners and family gatherings, she'd pretend I wasn't even there. Jacob sometimes noticed this, and would talk to her about it. But she never changed. Once, she even called me stuck up and spoiled, just because my parents had sent me to private school, while she'd been a public school teacher. I later found out she'd tried to convince Jacob not to marry me, telling him he could do better. Thankfully, he didn't care what she thought and proposed to me anyway. But when Sarah and my mother-in-law found out about the proposal, they lost it. Both of them called me, trying to convince me this was a bad idea. Since Jacob wouldn't listen to them, they expected me to return the ring and walk away. I found it absurd and firmly told them they were crossing a line. I loved Jacob and wanted to build a future with him, and I wasn't going to let them intimidate me. When they realized they couldn't manipulate me, my mother-in-law switched tactics and said I should try to be the best wife for him and take care of him like she always had. I found the remark offensive, but chose to let it go. Sarah, on the other hand, was less subtle. She straight up accused me of being a gold digger and told me her brother deserved someone of his level. She even warned me that she'd expose me before the wedding to stop it from happening. After hearing this, I immediately told Jacob everything. He was stunned at how cruel they were being and confronted them, but both his mother and sister stuck to their opinion that I wasn't good enough for him. Jacob told me to ignore them and reassured me that he loved me no matter what they thought. His words brought me some comfort, but it still hurt that his own family didn't want to accept me. Jacob and I had already decided to cover the wedding expenses ourselves. So when his mother offered to pay for half, we politely declined. Jacob explained that we had worked hard to save up and wanted to handle it on our own. Instead of being proud or happy for us, she got upset and told Jacob she was heartbroken that he didn't need her anymore. His father, however, reacted very differently. He seemed genuinely proud of us. He was calm, supportive, and never gave us any trouble about our relationship. Since Jacob's mom kept complaining, we decided to meet her halfway by letting her organize the rehearsal dinner. She agreed, and we genuinely appreciated the gesture. But as the wedding drew closer, things took a strange turn. The first red flag was when Sarah invited herself over for dinner. She told Jacob she missed him, and by this time, we were living on our own after getting engaged. Thinking she simply wanted to reconnect with her brother, we agreed. Jacob even asked me if I was okay with it, and although I wasn't thrilled, I agreed. I didn't want to be rude to my soon-to-be sister-in-law. At dinner, everything seemed fine, until suddenly Sarah veered the conversation into strange territory. Out of nowhere, she started talking about how she absolutely despised cheaters, calling them nothing more than useless pieces of... We looked at her, puzzled, wondering where she was going with this. Then she turned to me, looked me dead in the eye, and asked how it felt to be a useless piece of... My brows furrowed. In total confusion, I stared at her, and then Sarah exploded, accusing me of having an affair with my coworker, Zach. Jacob immediately asked what she meant by that, and Sarah, clearly feeling triumphant, began waving around photos of me and Zach like she had just cracked some big case. I already knew I'd never cheated on Jacob, so I was more curious than scared. I took a look at the pictures, and they were completely harmless. It's true Zach and I were close co-workers, but only because we started at the company around the same time. We helped each other when we made mistakes so our boss wouldn't chew us out. Zach even had a girlfriend, and Jacob knew all about it. I never hid anything. My phone didn't even have a lock, and I'd always been open with Jacob about who I worked with. But somehow Sarah had twisted these innocent moments into some kind of imagined affair, manufacturing evidence where there was none. Her accusations weren't just baseless, they were malicious. I could feel a wave of anger rise in me at how she was trying to smear my name and damage my relationship with Jacob. Before I could even respond, Jacob, stunned and visibly angry, jumped to my defense. He turned to Sarah and demanded to know why she was following me around, taking photos of me with coworkers in public without my knowledge. Sarah tried to justify it by saying she was only doing it to protect him. She claimed I was beneath their status and was probably marrying him just for money. Jacob shut that down immediately. He told her she was making things up and creating drama where there was none. He asked her to stop lying and interfering in our relationship, but she kept screaming at him to open his eyes to the affair that wasn't even real. I also tried to explain that Zach and I were just co-workers, but she refused to listen, clinging to her fantasy. The tension kept building until I'd finally had enough. I looked her straight in the eye and told her I was going to file a police report for stalking me and taking my pictures without consent. Her face went pale. She asked if I was serious, and I said yes. I told her I had all the evidence needed and that her actions were not only disgusting but criminal. She'd tried to defame me with lies and twisted narratives, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. Sarah turned to Jacob and then back to me, suddenly pleading. She claimed she only did it to protect her brother and didn't think it was such a big deal. She begged Jacob to convince me not to press charges, saying it would ruin her job and her future. But I stood firm. I told her only she could save herself. When she asked what I wanted, I told her I wouldn't go to the police as long as she stayed out of my life, permanently. She realized she was cornered. Jacob backed me up, telling her she was lucky I was giving her this chance, because what she did was unforgivable. Sarah finally agreed, grudgingly, to stay away from me, and since that day, she and I haven't spoken. She still keeps in contact with Jacob, but she's never dared to say another word to me. Then came the second disaster. This one, the night before our wedding, during the rehearsal dinner. Jacob's mother, who had insisted on taking full responsibility for the event, had declined all offers of help from us. She made it clear she wanted to handle everything herself, but when we showed up to the venue, it was a total mess. Plastic tablecloths thrown over picnic tables. Cold Mexican takeout. No warmth, no planning, no thoughtfulness. It felt less like a rehearsal dinner and more like a last-minute work potluck. Throughout the evening, she acted sulky and cold. Then, after a few drinks, she got loud and inappropriate, whining to other guests about how she couldn't wait for the wedding stuff to be over and how stressful it had all been, despite not contributing a single cent or any actual help. Eventually, my father-in-law had enough and pulled her aside to escort her out. Sarah, of course, tried to defend her mother's behavior, but Jacob's dad shut her down immediately. It was an utter disaster, and I started to panic, wondering if these two women were going to somehow ruin our actual wedding the next day. That night, I couldn't sleep. Jacob and I had our first real fight. I told him firmly that he needed to uninvite both Sarah and his mother from our wedding. With the way they had been behaving, I was convinced they would do something to ruin or upstage our big day. Jacob pushed back immediately. He was adamant that his father would be present and wouldn't allow anything to go wrong, but I had reached my limit. I gave him an ultimatum. If he didn't uninvite them, there would be no wedding. Jacob was visibly stunned. I knew how I sounded. I wasn't proud of forcing his hand, but I couldn't stop picturing those women sabotaging my special day. I didn't want to be humiliated in front of my loved ones. Jacob had always struggled to set boundaries with them, but I hoped that by drawing a hard line, he'd finally understand how much their behavior was impacting our relationship. Thankfully, he did. Early the next morning, Jacob called his father and told him that his mother and sister were officially uninvited. His dad didn't even sound surprised. In fact, he reassured Jacob that he would make sure they didn't show up uninvited. Not long after that call, both his mother and Sarah started blowing up Jacob's phone, clearly trying to convince him to reverse the decision. But Jacob stayed firm. He told them that after how they had treated me, he didn't feel comfortable having them at the wedding. That's when things got ugly. His mother started blaming me, saying I was a terrible woman who had come between a son and his family. Sarah tried reasoning with him too, but Jacob stood his ground. I did feel guilty, especially knowing that his dad wouldn't be able to attend because of his wife and daughter. For a moment, I even questioned whether my ultimatum was too harsh. But all that guilt vanished when I learned something shocking. Later, some of Jacob's cousins told me about a women-only family WhatsApp group where Sarah had encouraged everyone to wear white to the wedding. She'd even said there was no reason the bride should be the only one in white. I was floored. Their plan to upstage me wasn't just in my head. It had been real. After hearing that, I was relieved we had uninvited them. Jacob did miss his family that day, but he also completely understood where I was coming from. And honestly, the wedding turned out beautifully. No drama, no chaos, no one trying to steal our moment. Since that day, Jacob's mother and sister cut all contact with me, which I was more than fine with. They only invited Jacob for dinners or special family occasions, and I never objected. His father, on the other hand, remained kind and supportive, and we kept in touch over the years. Jacob and I saved diligently, and after a lot of hard work finally bought our first home this year. It was a big milestone, and we were incredibly proud. When his parents and Sarah came over for a small housewarming, I chose to avoid them entirely. I visited my own parents that day instead. Now here's where things took a turn. Just last month, completely out of the blue, Jacob's mother called me. I was stunned. We hadn't spoken since the day I married her son. At first, she was strangely pleasant, asking how I was and how life had been. I was caught off guard, but answered her questions politely. Then, out of nowhere, she asked how it felt to live in such a big house with just me and Jacob. Her words stung more than I expected. You see, Jacob and I had been trying to have a baby for a long time, but due to infertility issues, we hadn't been successful. It had been a painful journey. We grieved the idea of parenthood, and over time came to accept that it might never happen for us. I'd even told Jacob early on that I'd understand if he wanted to leave me for someone who could give him children, but he always refused. He said we were enough for each other, that he'd rather live childless with me than start over with someone else. Our families were aware of this, which made my mother-in-law's comment all the more cruel, and then she twisted the knife further by informing me, ever so casually, that Sarah was pregnant again. I was stunned. This would be Sarah's 6th child. Jacob had told me before that her husband was unemployed and irresponsible, refusing to use protection and constantly leading to these accidental pregnancies. Honestly, Sarah's partner was the embodiment of laziness and did absolutely nothing around the house to support her or the kids. From what Jacob's told me, her husband treats Sarah like his personal maid. He doesn't pay a single bill, and while she juggles multiple part-time jobs, he spends all day gaming. Despite countless people urging her to leave him, Sarah never does. Then my mother-in-law dropped a bombshell. She said that since Sarah couldn't afford to work throughout her pregnancy, she thought it would be a great idea if Jacob and I gave up our home, because, apparently, it was too big for a childless couple like us. I was stunned. I struggled to even find words. I asked if she was joking, but she just carried on, saying Sarah and her husband deserved a bigger place, and since there was no room for them at her own house, she had already told them they could move in with us. I sat there, speechless, trying to wrap my head around the audacity of that statement. I told her, as calmly as I could, that this was our house, one we were still making payments on. The idea of someone just deciding to move in, without asking us, was beyond ridiculous. But she insisted, saying she had already talked to Jacob, and he'd agreed. That stopped me cold. Jacob and I share everything. There's no way he would have made a decision like that without telling me. I pushed back firmly. I told her that the house belonged to both of us, and Jacob couldn't make that call alone. No one was moving in without both of our approval. To try to compromise, I told her we'd be willing to host Sarah and her husband for a few days if they needed help, but we weren't offering permanent housing. That's when my mother-in-law lost it. She started yelling, saying it was my duty as a daughter-in-law to make space for them, and if I just agreed, all the past misunderstandings would be forgiven. At that point, my patience snapped. I replied, "Sure, I'd be happy to let them have our place, but since we're still paying the mortgage, and I know for a fact Sarah and her husband won't help with it, why don't you take some responsibility and start covering it? We'll even cover all the bills. You just take care of the mortgage. And I know you can't afford that on your single teaching job, so when are you planning to get a second job to help support Sarah and her family living here?" That was it. She erupted into furious shouting, furious that I dare suggest something so ridiculous. I calmly told her that it was just as ridiculous for her to expect us to let them live with us rent-free. She yelled some more while I smiled in quiet satisfaction. Then she finally realized I wasn't budging and hung up the phone. Moments later, Sarah called, screaming at me for having the nerve to ask her mom to pay our mortgage. She went off, calling me a gold digger again. I fired back, telling her she was the real gold digger, trying to live in a house she hadn't paid a cent for. And if she really wanted to see who was digging for gold in the family, she should take a good look at her own husband, the man who sat on the couch all day doing nothing while she worked herself into the ground. That shut her up. I ended the call by saying she could argue all she wanted, but she and her family would never live in our house unless they were ready to split the mortgage. She called me heartless and accused me of caring more about money than family. But for once, I wasn't shaken. I finally felt like I had stood up for myself, reclaimed control over my home, and stopped letting them push me around. And yet, despite all this, I still feel a little guilty. I find myself thinking about it, about Jacob, about everything, and now I'm here on Reddit wondering, did I go too far? Did I become the villain in all of this? Thank you so much to everyone who's supported me. To answer the question I've seen the most, why would my mother-in-law even dare to make such an outrageous demand? The reason my mother-in-law feels so entitled to make demands like this is simple. She's always been that way. And honestly, My husband has enabled it for far too long. It's clear to me now that he and I need to sit down and have a serious, no-holding-back conversation. It's pathetic how she's even willing to lie about her own son just to manipulate the situation to her benefit. Sarah, meanwhile, is just a pawn in her game, doing whatever their mother says in hopes of finally earning the same kind of favoritism Jacob has always received. In this case, Sarah had everything to gain. She could rely on us to cover her bills and care for her children, while her useless husband sat around doing nothing. I'm currently waiting for Jacob to return from a business trip so we can talk in person. This is far too important to be discussed over the phone. It's been 3 days since my last update. As I mentioned, I was waiting for Jacob to come back so we could talk face to face. When he returned, we finally sat down, and I told him everything. How his mother called me demanding that we give up our house for his sister and her family. Jacob was genuinely shocked. He said the only thing his mother had told him before he left was that Sarah was pregnant, nothing more. He had no clue about the outrageous demands she made while he was gone. I told him that I expected him to deal with this. I'd reached my breaking point with his family, and I wasn't going to carry that burden anymore. He agreed. Right then and there, he called his mom and put her on speaker. He asked her directly why she lied to me about him supposedly agreeing to let Sarah move in. Caught red-handed, she immediately tried to backpedal, saying she hadn't exactly lied. She claimed she just assumed he wouldn't mind, so she took it upon herself to ask me directly. Jacob stopped her mid-sentence and asked why she would assume he'd be okay with something that major, especially without even mentioning it to him. She said that since he and Sarah were close, it was obvious he'd want to help her. I closed my eyes in frustration but kept quiet, letting Jacob handle it. Then Jacob told her, clearly and firmly, that there was no way Sarah, her deadbeat husband, and their 6 kids were moving in with us. He told her she had no right to push that on us. His mother began yelling that Sarah needed help, but Jacob shut her down. He said if she was so concerned, she could take care of Sarah herself. That's when she said Phil didn't want them living with him, and that their house was too small, so obviously our big house was the solution. And then, without hesitation, she added that since I was childless anyway, taking care of Sarah's kids would give me a sense of fulfillment. My eyes widened. I couldn't believe she went there. But then, something incredible happened. I saw Jacob's face turn red with fury. He snapped. He yelled at her that she had no right to say something so cruel and insensitive to his wife, that she couldn't use my infertility as some emotional leverage to guilt us into raising someone else's children. He went on, saying that their father didn't want anything to do with Sarah because she'd turned into a child-birthing machine, and he was tired of both of them. My mother-in-law tried to backtrack, but Jacob wasn't done. He told her he had tried to keep a relationship with them despite their constant disrespect toward me, but this crossed every line. He told her that this was the moment he was done. She started to beg, but he cut her off. He told her this was our house, that I was his wife, and anyone who disrespected me disrespected him, and didn't deserve a place in his life. Then he ended the call. Since then, he's had zero contact with either of them. Phil did call afterward, and after hearing everything, he completely understood. He even called me separately to apologize on behalf of his wife, but I told him it wasn't his fault. He had always treated me with kindness. It's been an interesting 2 weeks. Many of you suggested I install security cameras around our house, just in case Sarah or my mother-in-law decided to show up and cause a scene. I took your advice. I ordered a full camera system online and installed them all. As luck would have it, they did show up. Last weekend, in fact, I was home alone when the doorbell rang. I checked the security camera feed and sure enough, there they were, my mother-in-law and Sarah both fuming. I called Jacob immediately and he said he was on his way. When I opened the door, they demanded to be let inside. I stood firm. I told them they weren't welcome and if they had anything to say, they could say it from outside. That didn't sit well with my mother-in-law. She immediately began yelling, calling me heartless, greedy, and selfish. I calmly reminded her that this was our home, and they had no right to barge in uninvited. She kept ranting, totally unaware that the entire confrontation was being recorded by our security cameras. I reiterated what I had told her before, that I would not be handing over my home to Sarah and her husband. If she had anything further to discuss, she could wait for Jacob to return. Sarah chimed in, screaming that I was tearing the family apart for no reason, accusing me again of being a gold digger, and saying I was trying to take her brother away from them. That's when I dropped the final warning. I informed them that every word they were saying was being recorded, and that I would be using the footage to file a restraining order against them. I told them that if they didn't leave our property immediately, they'd be legally barred from coming within 50 feet of our home. Their eyes widened. My mother-in-law yelled, "You wouldn't dare!" I smiled and told her plainly, "Try me." Sarah tried to downplay everything, saying I was overreacting and that it wasn't that serious. Fortunately, Jacob arrived just then. He walked toward us calmly and asked his mother very directly what they were doing there. She rushed to hug him, but he deflected it and repeated his question, this time more firmly. Sarah started accusing me again, saying I was controlling him and keeping him away from his family. I rolled my eyes at how absurd it all sounded. Jacob looked them both dead in the eye and said he was the one who chose to go no contact. He told them he was done with the manipulation and toxicity. My mother-in-law started begging for forgiveness, but Jacob wasn't moved. He told them to leave the property immediately, or he would call the police. The shock on their faces was priceless. They clearly weren't expecting him to take such a hard stance. He made it clear that if they ever showed up uninvited again, we would not hesitate to get law enforcement involved. They left, still seething, but without another word. Later, Jacob spoke with his father, who was just as shocked as we were to learn they had shown up uninvited and behind his back. Phil told us we were right not to let them in, and admitted that he too was growing increasingly frustrated with their behavior. With Jacob being this resolute, I'm confident they won't dare show up again, and if they do, I'll have a lawyer draft a legal notice immediately. I'm incredibly relieved to see Jacob finally standing up for me. It feels like we've turned a corner. I'm hopeful that this is truly the end of the drama, and that we can now live our lives peacefully, without interference from his toxic family. I truly hope this is my last update. I'm ready to put this all behind me and move on for good.